24 years old. A hemp rope creaked under tension on Bishop Hill. The Third Reich did not require innate monsters to operate its death camps. The regime issued the license for absolute sadism to ordinary citizens along with a uniform. How did a 24-year-old girl from Hamburg end up on the same execution list as a concentration camp commandant? The system needed executors, not maniacs. She stood on the wooden platform. Beside her waited hardened capos and the Stutthof camp supervisor, a striking visual contrast. No panic, no tears. She delivered her final statement with clinical detachment. Life is indeed a pleasure, and pleasures are usually short. Roll the timeline back. Before the uniform, she lived as a standard civilian. No violent background, no psychological anomalies. But by 1946, her exact age dictated a specific psychological blueprint. Her entire adolescent socialization occurred exclusively inside the NSDAP educational apparatus. The League of German Girls shaped her reality. Total ideological formatting. The state did not break her mind, it manufactured it. The camp administration simply weaponized her obedience. Today, the name Jenny-Wanda Barkmann occupies a single line as a footnote in the documentary ledger of the Stutthof trials. The execution protocol dictated mechanical asphyxiation. No broken cervical vertebrae, only a slow restriction of oxygen. But the liquidation sequence for the 24-year-old guard encountered a critical system failure in front of 200,000 witnesses. The drop signal registered. The ignition engaged. The metallic grinding of a faulty army truck starter cut through the dead silence. The engine failed. This mechanical breakdown sharply contrasted with an absolute, unnatural human composure. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann stood on the cargo bed. A hemp rope rested tightly against her throat. She showed no panic. Her psychological state exhibited total clinical detachment. Basic biological survival instincts were completely suppressed. Her hair remained perfectly arranged. She stood on the edge of the wooden platform, entirely disconnected from the physical reality of the gallows. 200,000 spectators watched the procedural delay unfold. Barkmann simply stared back at the masses, a psychopathic isolation from the mechanics of her own death. The starter ground a second time. Her posture remained rigid. Finally, the engine caught. The truck chassis pulled forward. Gravity finalized the procedure. Down the central structure, the exact same sequence eliminated the remaining 10 condemned. 11 bodies hung motionless in the fading July evening. The sheer density and behavioral shifts of the spectator crowd alarmed the state administration. Institutional retaliation immediately retreated behind closed doors. The national counter for public war crimes executions in Poland permanently stopped at 0. Rough hemp ropes chafed the hands of the volunteers. These men had survived the camps. Now they stood waiting. Why did the justice system appoint non-professionals as execution operators? The authorities deliberately delegated the right of lethal retribution to the surviving victims. They held the nooses. Their former masters stood before them. The entire infrastructure for this mass liquidation on Biskupia Gorka Hill was engineered specifically for mechanical asphyxiation. It was July 4, 1946. Carpenters erected a strict row of wooden T-shaped supports. Right in the center stood a reinforced triple gallows. They built it specifically for Camp Commandant Johann Pauls and his senior staff. The sharp geometry of the bare wooden beams cut violently against a massive sea of human faces. Because the hill served as a natural amphitheater, the sight lines remained completely unobstructed. Operators positioned standard army transport trucks directly beneath the heavy crossbeams. They backed the vehicles into exact alignment. 11 condemned prisoners climbed onto the open flatbeds. The survivors slipped the loops around the necks of their former tormentors. The state mandated the short drop method. A short fall lacked the kinetic energy required to snap the cervical vertebrae and instantly sever the spinal cord. There would be no quick fracture. Instead, the design triggered a slow, deliberate compression of the windpipe and carotid arteries. Death by cerebral hypoxia and forced strangulation would take up to 15 minutes. 200,000 people, the equivalent of an entire city population, stood assembled to witness this exact procedure of suffocation. The officer dropped his hand. The drivers engaged the clutches. The military trucks drove synchronously forward. 34 days before the military vehicles pulled away from the gallows, the tribunal finalized the paperwork. On the 31st of May, 1946, the court officially issued the protocol for physical liquidation. Jenny-Wanda Barkmann stood at the dock. The charge was absolute. The indictment confirmed crimes against humanity. The state mandated termination by hanging. She registered no clinical distress. She faced the room. Her vocal delivery remained completely stable. She articulated one statement for the transcript. "Life is indeed a pleasure, and pleasures are usually short." She resumed her seat. The tribunal had just defined the extreme scale of her atrocities. Barkmann bypassed the legal reality. She turned to the armed escort. She requested a hand mirror. She assessed her reflection. The interval between this verdict and the physical elimination constituted exactly 34 days of waiting on death row. The tribunal scheduled the hanging procedure for the 4th of July, 1946. The execution order guaranteed her death. Yet during the first Gdansk tribunal in April 1946, Jenny-Wanda Barkmann treated the proceedings like a theatrical performance. She modified her hairstyle daily. She actively flirted with the armed escort. She was 24 years old. How does the psyche react when death becomes a mathematical inevitability? It completely blocks out reality. The judicial verdict meant rapid physical elimination. She responded with a simple smile. Exactly 6 weeks separated the final sentence from the rope. Technicians constructed a row of wooden pillars at Biskupia Gorka. They calculated the required drop distances. They positioned the transport vehicles. 200,000 people surrounded the execution zone. That volume equaled the entire population of a mid-sized European city of that era. They abandoned their daily routines. They converged on the hill in massive crowds. They gathered solely to observe a synchronized human termination. Barkmann stood elevated on the rear platform of a military truck. Guards bound her wrists tightly behind her back. Her posture remained completely rigid. An executioner positioned the thick hemp cord just above her collarbone. He locked the knot directly against her cervical vertebrae. The procedure lacked standard trapdoors. The mechanics relied entirely on rapid vehicular acceleration to snap the spinal cord. She waited for the sudden jerk. The heavy hum of the diesel motor vibrated through the wooden floorboards directly into her boots. The driver started the military truck's engine. 6 weeks before the truck tore the platform from under her boots, Barkmann sat in the Gdansk courtroom. The first Stutthof trial opened on the 25th of April, 1946. 14 defendants occupied the dock. The prosecution presented rigid, documented facts of severe physical abuse. Barkmann countered by openly flirting with her military guards. The press labeled her insane. The prosecution identified a different anomaly. Her behavior was not clinical madness. It was a calculated defense strategy. She weaponized her narcissism. She altered her hairstyle for every single judicial session. Braids on Monday, waves on Tuesday, pinned curls by midweek. Barkmann operated under the assumption that physical attractiveness guaranteed legal immunity. This tactic had always secured her survival in Hamburg. She expected the same systemic failure here. The tribunal dismantled this illusion through mechanical precision. The Soviet-Polish Investigative Commission supplied the foundational paperwork. Witnesses approached the wooden stand. They stripped away their trauma and delivered raw data. The dry rustle of court protocols echoed through the hall whenever a survivor confirmed the exact dates of her crimes. Former prisoners identified the specific shifts she worked. They matched her physical location to the transport logs. They provided the precise names of the victims she beat. The mathematical weight of the testimonies neutralized her performance. The documentation left zero margin for appeal. The court delivered the official verdict on the 31st of May, 1946. Barkmann calculated her invulnerability with absolute precision. That logic collapsed in January 1945. The Red Army breached the Eastern Front. She was 22 years old. Why did the perfect disguise in the refugee stream fail? The defect was clinical vanity. The SS dismantled the Stutthof infrastructure. Guards pushed thousands of prisoners onto the roads. An icy Baltic wind cut through the moving columns. Barkmann abandoned her post. She discarded the uniform. She fabricated a new identity and moved west. During Operation Hannibal, over 1 million fleeing civilians choked the evacuation routes. By May 1945, the Gdansk station operated as a central logistical filter. Hundreds of thousands of displaced people jammed the transit terminals. In this massive transit hub, survival required absolute anonymity, and refusing to merge with the exhausted gray mass guaranteed statistical suicide. But Barkmann retained her pathological need for attention. She rejected plain clothing. She refused to conceal her features. Days after the German surrender, Barkmann entered the main hall of the Gdansk station. She carried a single small suitcase. She stood upright among the collapsed refugees. A former Stutthof inmate spotted her in the crowd. The survivor locked visual contact with the former guard. She turned away and walked quietly to a Polish security officer. The officer approached Barkmann from behind. He detained her directly on the platform. She offered zero resistance. The silent arrest on the Gdansk platform and the drop from the gallows completed a strict sequence. A sequence that started in Hamburg. Barkmann's death accidentally closed a historical window. Europe stopped hanging criminals in open squares. 5 subsequent trials of Stutthof personnel took place. Authorities moved them all behind closed prison walls. What forced an ordinary girl to voluntarily become an executioner when the war was already lost? The answer is not innate pathology. It is systemic adaptation. By 1944, the mathematics of the conflict were absolute. Germany faced a statistical certainty of defeat. Allied bombers systematically leveled the industrial centers. Soviet armor pushed from the east. Joining the SS at this exact stage was not naive patriotism. It was a conscious, calculated integration into a functioning mechanism of absolute violence. Her brutal methods were not a biological defect. They were an acquired protocol. Rewind to 1944. A polite resident of Hamburg with zero military background signed a voluntary contract with the Schutzstaffel. The civic framework had collapsed. The state deleted standard legal rules. Quartermasters issued unrestricted authorization for physical cruelty directly from the supply depot. They handed it to her right alongside the standard gray uniform. The mechanics of this newly acquired cruelty materialized inside the SK3 subcamp of Stutthof. Located 20 miles east of Danzig, this facility gave her absolute jurisdiction over human survival. How exactly did she execute this authority? The protocol required minimal effort. Just a simple movement of an index finger. Right meant the labor barracks. Left meant the gas chamber. Barkmann stood on the muddy sorting ground. Her face remained entirely calm. Her index finger traced a smooth line through the damp air. The mass of prisoners split into 2 separate columns. One column marched toward the workshops. The guards routed the second column directly to the extermination block. Her meticulously styled hair contrasted sharply against the dirty, swampy forest of the Vistula Delta. She did not wait for official directives to inflict damage. She engineered her own methods of punishment. She used her fists. She used leather belts. She swung any heavy object within reach. She systematically extracted women from the lineup based on visual similarities to past acquaintances. She beat them until their bones fractured. Survivors testified she often smiled during these operations. Her individual actions fed a larger industrial machine. 100,000 inmates passed through the gates of Stutthof. 60,000 of them died there. This 60% mortality rate represented a standard operational metric for facilities operating an integrated extermination system. The surviving prisoners originated a specific moniker to classify this daily combination of pristine aesthetics and lethal authority. They named her the Beautiful Specter. This absolute authority at Stutthof was no random assignment. 21-year-old Barkmann walked into an SS recruitment center to claim it herself. What forced her to refuse civilian work? The drive for uniform, status, and power inside a collapsing economy. The year was 1944. The Eastern Front collapsed. Allied troops secured Normandy. Wehrmacht casualty rates forced a systemic military shift. To replace male guards sent to the trenches, the SS actively expanded its female auxiliary corps, the SS Gefolge. At the moment of signing the contract, she did not yet know this paper would lead her to the gallows. The state issued no conscription for this position. Barkmann bypassed factory quotas. She ignored hospital drafts. The selection process required proactive consent. She stood inside the recruitment office. She reviewed the standard terms. Barkmann picked up the pen and signed the contract to become an Officerin in the SS concentration camp system. That ink stroke in the summer of 1944 did not spontaneously engineer a sadist. It merely finalized a psychological calibration that began in Hamburg on May 30th, 1922. A child absorbs the state baseline. Poverty dictates the initial conditions. Bread queues stretched across the port city. Unemployment lines replaced normal civic routines. Then, the government restructures the environment. She turned 11. Adolf Hitler secured the chancellor position. The state standardized radical ideology as everyday life. She turned 16. The regime executed Kristallnacht. The sharp sound of shattering synagogue windows echoed heavily through the streets of Hamburg. Neighbors walked past the debris. The violence was entirely legal. She observed a simple mechanism. Cruelty carried no penalty if the authorities approved. Investigators later reviewed her early behavioral profiles. Witnesses described a polite, highly cooperative teenager. She sat in front of the mirror for hours. She brushed her hair repeatedly, analyzing her reflection, calculating her angles for a future career as a fashion model. She demanded attention. She wanted the world to watch her. Then German armor crossed the Polish border. She was only 17.